As Michiganders, we have access to some of the most varied natural resources in our country. Now, one species that you may not be too aware of is our crayfish population. Well, today I was joining a couple of guys from the DNR to learn about crayfish trapping. And if things went well, show me an old-fashioned crawdad boil. We started by setting up some new traps along a rocky river edge, and then checking some that were hopefully full of crayfish. With some changes to the regulations, we felt it was time to learn more about the rusty crayfish, which is actually an invasive species.
So rusty crayfish have been in the state of Michigan roughly since the 1970s. It's really proliferated and become abundant in a lot of our northern waters. And the ability that these invasive rusty crayfish have actually is they're very aggressive and have the ability to outcompete some of our native species. For example, the northern crayfish. So when these invasive rusty crayfish become introduced and established, they have actually the ability to displace some of our northern or native crayfish, which can cause some ecological impacts. So the good way to tell especially the rusty crayfish apart from some of our native crayfish is a rust red colored spot on the side of their body. This is a distinctive characteristic that only the rusty crayfish have, and none of the native crayfish species within the state will have that rusty red colored spot on the side of their carapace.
Traps with floats is a great way to get crayfish.
So the floats are to easily find them the next day when you go to lift them. And then also when you're in deeper water, you can actually pull the trap up itself by the buoy. Instead, I mean, in shallow water right here, you won't necessarily need them, but in deeper water, buoys are really useful.
Now, once you've placed your traps, which can be homemade or some modified minnow traps work well, it really doesn't take long, if there are crayfish in your waters, to get quite a few of these tasty critters.
We modified our regulations to address, we typically modify our regulations to reduce risk of introduction of invasive species. But with rusty crayfish now being established and abundant in many of our waters in Michigan, we wanted to provide our anglers or anyone with a fishing license the ability to keep these natives for food consumption. So the new regulation allows for the possession of rusty crayfish to keep, to bring home for a crayfish boil, versus in the past they're on our prohibited and restricted species list, which means the live possession is actually illegal.
There is also one more change in crawfish regulations that anglers in Michigan should be aware of.
So red swamp crayfish, as of this year, are now illegal to possess live. And the reason why we did this was to reduce the potential risk of introduction into the state of Michigan. And this risk was concern was elevated in 2013 after some of our conservation officers noticed that anglers were going to live food markets, purchasing them, and then using them as live bait in some of our systems. So unfortunately, that activity is occurring, but to try to account for that, we've modified our regulations to protect some of our resources from these crayfish that are considered one of the most invasive crayfish worldwide.
So between the natives and the rusties, you can find yourself enough for a good crawdad boil.
We're going to do your basic down south crayfish boil. We got red potatoes, sweet corn, lemons, onions, and then crayfish boil, which is basically a mixture of salt, cayenne pepper, chili powder, paprika, and black pepper. And then there's a couple other crayfish recipes you can look up online, Swedish crayfish or etouffee, but this is what we're going with today. It's pretty basic and easy to do.
And how do you know when everything's done?
So you start out with boiling your vegetables just like you would do a stew or something like that. And then after you feel the potatoes are done, I usually go about 7 to 8 minutes with the crayfish to make sure they're all boiled through. All right, so we got our veggies in there. There are potatoes, corn, lemon, the salt and pepper, all the spices. So next step is to take our mud bugs here, crayfish, and we made sure that they're all live. They cook better when they're live, otherwise they sometimes have a foul taste. Then we just dump them directly into the pot.
And so the seasoning's already in there?
Yep, everything's already in there.
All right. Now, Seth told me there are a couple of main ways to capture crayfish.
Well, there's multiple different techniques to capture crayfish. Some people will build their own. Other people will purchase minnow traps. Actually work baited with any kind of fish, or beef liver actually is a common bait that folks will throw in their traps. But you can also go out and just grab them with your hands. You know, the typical flipping the rock and finding the crayfish and grabbing them with your hands, or even a small dip net can be very effective for capturing crayfish.
If there are crayfish in your area, they're pretty easy to find and quite plentiful.
Typically shallow water. Anytime you can get in shallow water where there's some rocky shoreline or rocky substrate, it's a pretty good spot, and you'll typically find some rusty crayfish if they're there.
Now, I have had crawfish in the southern part of our country and loved them, so I was really interested to see just how these would stack up. They are a little harder to get to the tail meat, but you know what? It's worth the effort. Well, what do you think?
Pretty good.
Is it gonna work?
Oh yeah.
What do you think, Seth?
Just another way to enjoy Michigan's natural resources right here.
There you go. For more information about crayfish, please see the DNR guidebooks. It's important that we keep an eye on the invasives that come into our Great Lakes system. And I have to say, if a shore lunch like this is one way to combat the issue of invasives, well, count me in here in Michigan's Out of Doors.